right. Welcome to Science Sunday, everyone. Happy September. We're doing all sorts of technical gadgetry all around us here. We're co-presenting with the Prairie State Humanists. Scott is to my right here, Scott Thompson, running a Zoom meeting, and maybe you're seeing us on the Zoom meeting. We're trying to get the camera set up so that you can get a look at the slides that I've prepared. If you're having trouble with the slides and want to see them, we are also on the DuPage Unitarian Church YouTube site. You can go to DuPageUUchurch.org and scroll down, and then there's a YouTube symbol. You can pick up on that, and you can also see us that way too. So thanks to the AV department up there keeping us going here. And there should be able to be comments coming in from the Prairie State Humanists at times, and hopefully we get all the technology stuff taken care of, and we can talk about a man who didn't have the benefits of that technology, Alfred Russell Wallace. Thanks for signing up, coming in. If you're seeing us live, it's a nice, cool September morning. Now it's noon, and we've had a little bit of rain today. So maybe you're not outside and you're inside watching. So I'm talking about Alfred Russell Wallace. He's piqued my interest at different times. We've talked about Darwinian evolution. I'm not going to emphasize trying to talk about Darwin and his ideas of evolution and so on. We've gone through that at different times, and it's not the emphasis of today's talk, but it's definitely the background of it. The talk is more about Alfred Russell Wallace, his life, what co-discovering evolution and natural selection meant to him, and what it meant to the world, and why his emphasis, why his contribution is important. So it's interesting, first of all, to talk about what does it mean to be a co-discoverer. And one interesting thing in science is that many times there seems to be a demand, a drive, a desire for some type of topic or invention or some scientific purpose to really be emphasized, to really be found out. And it seems like the times are right and things come along, and more than one person, many times in the history of science, mathematics, thought, art, music, has developed common solutions to questions that have been out there. So I thought I'd review just that a little bit here. Co-discovery, like I say, is rather common in science. And these are, for example, at the same time, and I wanted to leave these for you to think about, the Human Genome Project had a goal and a purpose, and at the same time, another group called the Celera Corporation was also investigating this same scientific process. These ideas had been around for a while, but it seemed like they hit germane points at the time, and that is obviously in the name. I'm kind of trying to get more difficult for you to solve these as we go through this. So obviously the Human Genome Project and Celera Corporation worked independently, but at the same time to map the genome, the human genome, and were successful in about 2004, about a year before they had published that they thought they would be able to do it. So common people working and both working at the same problem at the same time. Now these are some names that may be familiar to you, maybe not. David Buick, Carl Benz, and Ransom Olds. All working in the 1880s, 1890s about a common issue, and I hope that you have the answer to that is. You got one for that, Scott?
No, I don't. I'm mystified.
Oh, yeah?
Okay. I'm mystified.
Wow.
Could you ask folks to give just a thumbs up if they can hear us on the...
Sure. Scott's asking if you can hear us, give a thumbs up on the Zoom so he can monitor that at the Prairie State Humanists group.
Got it.
And he's getting it, so we're there and we're doing good, okay?
Right.
How many folks do we have listening so far?
Looks like about 8 or 10.
8 or 10. Okay, an even number at least, though. That's good.
Oh, yeah. We're not odd folk.
Yeah, rather. So, David Buick, Carl Benz, and Ransom Olds. I don't know if anyone has the capacity to type in or give an answer to that to you, Scott, on your on your area? or-
Let's see, yeah, there's a chat feature on Zoom. There's a little chat bubble that you can use to answer the question.
Okay. You do have a microphone just to your right as
Oh.
well.
Good. And it works. Good.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so any ideas, any answers?
No.
Automobiles. Buick, Benz, and Olds all were last names of people that developed in the 1880s and 90s into 1900. Different methods, different solutions for cars. So at that point, it became a very common thing for people to invent cars and means of going through understanding and development of a different type of transportation. Many of them were in Europe, but many of them were in Michigan area too. Flint, Michigan was a very famous spot where first there were wagon works before this, and then they got transferred over to become car making dealerships. And,
Is there something in the water in Michigan that caused all that?
not at that point. There wasn't anything in the water. Later on, there's something in the water, but we'll maybe do a Science Sunday about that too.
Too soon.
All right, so automobile manufacturers. Next one, Elisha Gray, who probably you haven't heard about, Alexander Bell. Development, co-discovery, another invention that came along in 1880s, I believe. And the development of that is a pretty interesting topic. As I was reading this, I thought, now that would be a neat thing to talk about too at the time. So co-discovery, in fact, there was a lot of animosity and anger and vitriol between these two people and then a couple of other people from Italy that came along and co-discovered at the same time. And this is the development, and maybe Alexander Bell would be easier to do it if I'd say Alexander and give you his middle name, Alexander Graham Bell. So co-discoverer of the
Popcorn machine.
telephone.
Oh,
You're so close. Because what's a good phone conversation without popcorn?
that's
around?
right.
So, telephone came out. Very many people in many places around the world. The telegraph had been successful, but that was just a simple on-off thing. You had sending a pulse that was able to send Morse code around to people. But the development of a diaphragm that vibrated and then sent electrical impulses that then could be changed back into sound systems that your ear can hear that mimic so completely the original sound. It's phenomenal. So yeah, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of discussions of theft of ideas and taking people's ideas, and people were running to the patent office to try to get there before the other person, and they were making it like with minutes ahead of someone else, and Alexander Graham Bell was accused of a lot of dastardly acts to try to get his patent working, and it tended to work for him. But co-discoverers with a lot of, not a lot of cooperation and a lot of animosity in that case. Moving along, Gottfried Leibniz and Isaac Newton. I know this is one you can pretend not to know, but you know. Gottfried Leibniz and Isaac Newton had a very heated discussion as to who did this development and who came up with this discovery.
I know this one, of course, but the others might have been a little more obscure, but everybody knows about calculus. So.
Calculus, right. So they came up with the calculus that was a whole new math independently, hundreds of miles apart from each other, and both developed these ideas. I think a lot of the terms actually were Leibniz's terms, but the concept is given more credence, or again, it got pretty vitriolic and angry, but Isaac Newton is more known, at least in the U.S., about that.
One of the interesting pieces of trivia about that is that Isaac Newton was recognized that calculus, his own invention, was a new thing, and when he was putting forth his arguments about mechanics and the theory of gravity, he actually used geometric mathematical arguments in lieu of calculus because he thought that it would be too much to try to get people to learn a whole new mathematical system at the same time he was sharing his innovative ideas about fundamental physics. So if
He didn't want to get lost in the numbers.
well, exactly. So
Yeah.
the Principia actually doesn't have much in the way of calculus. He makes, he talks about tangents to curves and all of that, which is relevant to calculus, but he does it all geometrically.
Interesting. But I think he did his development. It caused him to, he was able to solve the problems
Right,
he was
yeah.
looking at using the calculus, but then he converted it into a more understandable way for the common man to understand
Right.
his concepts. Right, so co-discoverers and with some heat and passion involved in there too. Now the last one, we've talked a little bit, Priestley, a Unitarian and a scientist from England, Carl Scheele from Germany, and Lavoisier, Antoine Lavoisier from France. They all independently and with different successes and different emphases and so on, but at roughly the same time, all discovered dephlogisticated air,
Right.
which is also oxygen. So again, co-discovering common things get solved, get understood, get taken in by people through that time. I hope that people, I don't know, can you see it, Scott, on your Zoom? Can people see what
Yeah.
what I've been reading?
Yeah,
off
you
of
all
here?
can see the slides that Mike is sharing, right? If you're doing
Put your-
gallery view.
Yeah.
Or
If you're on
speaker view.
Zoom or something, can you see put your thumb up if you can see the slides well enough. Okay,
Uh-oh. People are shaking their heads no.
not really, okay.
Oh, crud. I could try to.
You could zoom it in and they don't
Yeah.
have to look at us so much.
Yeah, there you go. Let me try that.
Or the other possibility is YouTube as well, but,
I think the microphone we're using for Zoom is up on my laptop, so be sure to speak up a little.
okay. All right. So just talking about that interesting topic of co-discovery and the values and the reasons why that happened and so on, but I wanted to introduce you a little bit more to Alfred Russell Wallace. Born in 1823, so Darwin was 14 years old when Alfred Wallace was born. Wallace always looked up to Darwin, had heard about his trip to the Amazon and read his books, and actually met him once in a library, and kind of the story is that he lost his voice. He couldn't communicate too well. He was awed by the presence of Charles Darwin, and this is way before the I'm a little bit thrown off. Scott just dropped a wire, but this was way before Darwin published Origin of Species and so on, but they both were interested in common things. Darwin was a little bit less interested or impressed with Wallace. He was a younger man that hadn't done too much that was of amazing nature yet, and so it was a meeting that Alfred Russell Wallace always treasured and Darwin never remembered. So I think I've been in a few of those meetings too, probably on the Wallace side of those things at times. So he lived until 1913, so he was 90 years old. He lived a good long life, kept scientifically active for his whole life. He traveled once to America and met up with one of his brothers who had emigrated to California, and met up with him and gave a series of speaking tours in, I believe, 1910. So he was 87 or something like that when he was traveling around the United States giving lectures. But if we talk about the early years of Wallace, he was born, like I said, January 8th in Wales. What's Wales today? He was the eighth of 9 children. He claimed to be a descendant of William Wallace, or his father actually was a Scotsman. But if your name was Wallace and your dad was a Scotsman, probably anybody like that would claim to have William Wallace as your forebear. But that was a claim that's pretty hard to prove. Not sure if it's known or not if he did, but that was the family claim. His father was a lawyer, but never really practiced law. He got involved. He was living, like many did at the time, the middle-class people. If you had land and faculties to work from, then basically they lived off the land or lived off the profits of renting their land out to other people. So that went on for a while, but his father then got involved in some poor planning, some poor trips, some poor investments that went downhill, and the family started sliding towards poverty. He was schooled wherever he was at. They put him in through some decent schools at the time, and schooling was important to them. At 5, the family moved to Hartford, England, and things weren't going as well. But he never went to college. At 14, actually, he left school. His father died, and he was sent to London to become a surveyor. Well, he worked for a while in his brother's business there, and then he became a surveyor. So in his early or mid-teens, he was basically working for his living. A few years later, he got a teacher's position in 1844. So he was 21 at the time, a teacher position in Leicester, England. He started going to the mechanics school there. I think the union halls had libraries, and that's where basically people could get books. He was an autodidact, and he just loved reading about different stories. So at this time, Darwin has been back from his trip around the world on the Beagle, and those were some of the stories and things he read. He met a young man a year or two younger than him called Henry Walter Bates, who was also there at the Mechanics Union Club in the library there, and at this time he had started doing some botany. Alfred Russell Wallace. He loved plants and some things. But actually, Henry Walter Bates is the man who showed him just the amazing things about beetles. And they went out on collections and looked for there. So from 1847, here's a note that he wrote in a letter that he wanted to study the origin of species. And he thought he should emphasize one of the beetles and just emphasize one family of beetles and start talking about how those species developed. And
Darwin liked beetles too, right?
Darwin liked beetles. Beetles were pretty amazing. I think there's a famous story or a joke about beetles that I think Darwin was asked, what did you learn, what amazing thing did you learn from so many of your studies? And he said that, judging by the preponderance of beetles in the world, he says that God must have a sincere love for beetles. Beetles are a sincere passion of God as well.
All the variety.
Yeah. So, and I'll talk about that. In fact, I'll jump ahead a second here. When Alfred Russell Wallace went on one of his collecting trips, that was an 8-year collecting trip. He was in the Malay Archipelago, Borneo, New Guinea, Java, all those areas. He collected 83,000 different beetles.
Wow.
That's 10,000 a year or more.
Yeah.
So, all amazing stories. Anyways, he and Bates got pretty excited about finding out about the origin of species and the different animals and so on, and they felt like they were kind of back in the backwaters of England, and finding beetles is pretty cool, but they had bigger fish to fry, bigger sights to see. And he, somewhat led by Darwin's successes and trips, Wallace decided that what he'd like to do is go to South America and travel through South America. So in April of 1848, he was 22 years old, and 25 years old, and Bates was 22 years old. The two of them self-funded a trip to the Amazon rainforest. So the two of them went there, Actually, Wallace was there for about 4 years, and Bates actually spent 11 years along there, and pretty amazing kind of trips and the things that they found. Henry Walter Bates is known for animal mimicry, his studies about that, which also supported evolution, and it's talking about the similar appearance, or animals that can mimic. You know, you've seen maybe butterflies that have dots on the back of their wings that make them look like an owl and can scare off their predators. The other mimicry is sometimes they would look like, they would appear to be like another kind of animal that would be, maybe have a bad taste, and animals knew not to eat this type of moth or whatever, and so another moth would mimic that moth's appearance, and then not be eaten as well too.
There's some snakes that do that, I think, also, right?
I know of a caterpillar that has its rear end, it can hunch its rear end up, and the rear end looks like a head of a snake.
Wow.
And can frighten off frogs or different things that might want to eat the caterpillar. But yeah. Yeah, and there's snakes that tend to appear to look like they're poisonous, venomous, right, too. So, yeah, they had this amazing trip to the Amazon. So, if you can see that map pretty well, looks like you can, that's good. The dark solid line is the Amazon River. On the right side, right at the, is where they landed, Bates and Wallace at Benin. And then they spent a few months together, actually, and then for reasons that aren't really clear, whether they thought they could cover more territory, or if their interests diverged, or if there was some level of, you know, not wanting to be along with the other. Actually, Bates went in and south. Some of those rivers that are flowing into the Amazon from the south was where he was spending time. The Araguaia and the Tocantins, those two that are the furthest south on here. I don't know if this points. Just south, straight south of Belém. That's where Walter Bates spent, 11 years in that area. And Wallace was over in the Rio Negro, which is near the town of Manaus, halfway up the Amazon, and then going to the north there. So it's another tributary of the Amazon. Actually, the two that Bates were at aren't logistically actually tributaries of the Amazon, but they flow out into the Atlantic Ocean very near where the Amazon does, and maybe have some confluence, but not much at all. But he spent time at the Rio Negro and did a lot of work there. Both of them were sending back samples and collections and so on. The whole way they were going to fund their trip was by collecting amazing different animals and sending them back to purchasers, buyers, either museums or private collectors, because having these amazing creatures displayed in your house was a pretty interesting thing to have in those years. You know, there's no television, there's not a lot of other things, but in people's reading rooms and in their lounges and different things like that, they like to bring out these selections and collections of critters and tell the stories about what each of those animals meant or where they were from and so on. So it was a highly popular thing, and well collected and well preserved specimens were of value to people in England and, you know, across the continent of Europe. So Wallace and Bates were feeding this collectors group, and top-notch collections, top-notch samples would get sold to museums as well too. So that was how they were paying for their things. There was a little bit of a mess up, and for some reason, much of the 4 years of collection, after a few months, his person that he was near this town of Manaus, and he was sending things down the river, all these carefully collected and preserved and pinned animals, and they'd get to the town of Belém, and the man that was supposed to be sending them back across the ocean wasn't doing it. He just was collecting them in the storeroom. It was some misunderstanding or something like that. So finally, after 4 years, in which part of the time one of Wallace's brothers came there and ultimately died of yellow fever, but Wallace came back to Belem, found out that all these things were sitting in a warehouse there, organized a boat, got a boat that would take him there and take him back to England, and he put all these years worth of samples on the boat, and they started on the trip back to England. 25 days in, it was a slow boat. The boat caught fire. And
In the middle of the Atlantic?
in the middle of the Atlantic. And all he could grab was a couple of notebooks, no samples of anything. All these years and years worth of samples were destroyed. He had live creatures there, macaws and different kinds of birds. He had monkeys. He had different things, and just thousands and thousands of samples, and all his notes that told him where he was when he found these things. You know, all his notes that made it scientific so he could identify where these things were found. All went down with the ship, as they say. He actually hurt himself fairly badly sliding down a rope to get into the lifeboat and burned his hands because they hadn't done proper lifeboat entering safety.
At the start of the cruise.
Right, at the start of the cruise, which is why they do that now all the time. But so he had badly burned hands, and the lifeboat was leaky, and they were out there and had no idea what had happened. They were in the boat for about 10 days, and finally they were picked up. I didn't want to keep the suspense too long. He did live through it.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
All right.
Just in case.
And this is a real picture of it, right?
It's a real picture, but it's not of that.
Oh, okay.
They didn't take a picture at the time. So yeah, the boat destroyed all his samples, all his years worth of work is now, down at the bottom of the Atlantic, and they get picked up by another slow boat, and it takes another 20 days almost to get back to England. And he's back there. By some stretch of luck or foresight or whatever, his purveyor of the goods, a man that was in charge of sending the goods, selling the goods that he brought back, had insured these things, but at a nominal amount. So he wasn't destitute, he wasn't terrible, but he had some money, but he had to make some choices, and he had to go. He talks about how when he was on this trip, he said he was never going to leave England again. He was going to keep in England, But time heals all wounds, I guess, and soon he got the urge again. So this is in April of, in 1852 is when he came back. Bates stayed there for, like I said, another 7 years, and kept on doing his development and experiments, and is quite a well-known scientist and explorer in his rights too. So he was back and decided that the bug got him again. He was interested in going, and he went to the Malay Archipelago, is what it was called at the time, the Malaysian area. The bigger island there that you see, kind of the solid roundish one in the middle, is Borneo. There's Sumatra, Java. The one to the bottom right is New Guinea, and just thousands of islands, amazing structures, and quite a place to go if you want to see wildlife and a way to look at the world. And just a whole variety of different kinds of creatures there, and things that he found out there are pretty amazing. So, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the size of the group. This is that island, Borneo, and it's superimposed over the United Kingdom. Actually, Borneo is, I think, the third largest island in the world that's not a continent. The largest island that's not a continent is Greenland, which we think of as massive, and with some of our map projections, it looks massive, and it is massive. It's 836,000 square miles. Well, the United Kingdom, or the British Isles, let's call it also, are 122,000 square miles, so roughly 1/4 of the size of Greenland. Borneo is 748,000 square miles, so very large. Just that one island, if we look back here at the map here, just that one island of Borneo, the bigger, rounder one in the middle, is close to the size of Greenland. And the other islands all had, so it's quite an area, quite a lot of square mileage to explore in and to find things. And for a couple of reasons, just because of its size and also because of some biogeographical things that he found and he developed, we'll talk about. It has just an amazing collection of different animals and plants and so on. And one of the things he came up with, and I'm not sure that he defined exactly why, but one of the things he came up with was the Wallace line. He described many new species when he was there. He was there for almost 8 years. He found 120,000 specimens of plants, insects, birds. He's got a special bird of paradise named after him. 120,000 different specimens, and like I said earlier, 83,000 beetles alone he found. So an amazing, incredibly rich place to study natural habitat. But one thing he discerned there was it's a fairly interesting place. It's large, a lot of mileage, a lot of square area, covers a lot of area, but not bigger than Africa or different things like that. But what he found was an amazing disparity in what animals lived in certain areas. If you look at the map, you can see this red line coming through that area. Borneo is just above and to the left of this red line that's coming kind of through the middle left-hand side of the map. There's Java and Sumatra on the left side, New Guinea on the right side, and Australia is actually shown there below to get you some evaluation of that too. But this red line was something that he found that creatures that lived on this, and this, sometimes this gap was only a few miles from Borneo to some of the near islands that are on the other side of the line, but the creatures that were there were completely different. Completely different. And that was puzzling. Usually you'd think that animals would disperse and get to find a niche for themselves and then come across a few miles of land. But even the birds that could fly this distance were very, very different. And the reason for that, now we realize, is that these were the remnants or the portions of two different continents. And they weren't always like this and always this close. The Australian continent shelf is coming in towards the Asian shelf. It's in the left there. And actually that shelf is subsuming below the other shelf. So this was stuff that Wallace didn't know about and not many people knew about. This was found out in, it was proposed in 1920s, I think, by Alfred Wegener, about continental drift and so on. But these areas had been, when these creatures developed onto these different islands, they had been much further apart. And the animals on the right side of this are Australian history. There are many marsupials. There are none of the larger, like the Sumatran hippo, I think, or rhinoceros. They're all on the left side of the line. A lot of the Asian species of elephants, elephant-like animals, and it goes down to the birds are different there, but the mammals on the right-hand side of the Wallace line are basically Australian in nature, marsupial, and the ones on the left side are Asian in historical perspective. So he wasn't sure why, but he did notice that gap in between those two islands is much deeper there than it is in other places. And again, that's because the shelves are colliding and it's two different continental realms.
So the ocean depth, he figured out the ocean depth there and found that it was deep?
Right, yeah, you know, they could drop anchors in different places or fathoming lines and different stuff like that. So pretty amazing discernment of what's happening and why. And the other thing that goes on is even though these islands are so close, you'd think that there would be mixing, that a bird would fly over and say, hey, this is a good place too, it's just as good as that other island. Actually, it didn't have a niche because let's say if they were coming from Australian side of the line and they'd fly over to the other side, there wasn't a niche available for them anymore. There was an animal that was already taking that, or they weren't used to the plants that were there, and they didn't have the food sources and so on that they had. So even though these islands are very close to each other, there is some level of intermingling of the species, but not to what you'd imagine, or not what you see in many other places. You see down in that string of islands by Sumatra and Java there, those islands just look like one island, it just looks like the next. Nothing would show up in any sense that these were so different, but they are. They are. So the Wallace line is a pretty amazing thing and worthy of more discussion and topic, although we don't have the time to right now.
What's that black line? Like?
That's the equator.
Oh, okay. It's
That's
hard to
showing the
read.
equator.
All right.
Yeah, the best picture I had of it, these are actually written in Spanish,
Okay.
Nueva Guinea,
Yeah.
and so on. So, yeah, then the far left is Sumatra, and then Borneo over on the Asian side, and Java. But on the right side, some of these islands are Flores, New Guinea, Celarus is the one in the middle there that the line just goes to the left of. That's,
Is that the same Flores from Homo florensis, the Hobbit?
you know, I think it is.
Yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah. Scott's talking about that small creature, a small hominid that was found that was something like 3.5 feet tall or something like that existed until maybe only about 6,000 or 8,000 years ago, something like that. So that's what he's referring to there. So I recommend getting on YouTube and just Googling Alfred Russell Wallace. There's some really nice videos that reenact his story and what he did. It's kind of, you know, you think of 8 years in here and you kind of imagine that he's like camping out all the time. There actually was a very strong presence of Dutch in this area. The Dutch Indies, the Dutch East India Company was getting tea from this area, was doing quite a bit of exploring and colonization in this area. So he often stayed, he'd like rent a house for a year or two on one of these kind of more major islands, and then he'd go off and take like a month, 2-month long trips to some of the other islands to see, to go do his collecting and so on. So I don't think it was a easy life, but I think he also had some level of comforts at times on his trip. But a very strong man to be able to do this for that much time.
And Darwin only went on the one voyage, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. After that, he was a homebody. The story about Darwin, I think it was 5 years around the world, he was seasick basically almost every day. He was not, he was not born to be on the Beagle.
Yeah, so Wallace traveled further and saw more diversity in some sense than Darwin would have.
Yeah, I mean, in each saw quite a bit. I mean, I'd say that Darwin had a lot of time spent in certain areas. He could really emphasize, you know, they spent time there, as did Wallace too. It's hard to say. Yeah, I would say that he probably put more miles on the ground, hiking around and doing stuff. A lot of Darwin's time was on a boat. The main purpose of the Beagle trip was to map the whole coast of South America. And so they were taking soundings and doing things, and you could see Darwin at times was able to encourage, and they'd let him off for 2 weeks, and he'd go off hiking and hunting in the wild, and then would meet up with the boat someplace without a cell phone or anything.
Wow.
But yeah, it's interesting, and both of them were very big on collecting, and by collecting, basically it means capturing or shooting or killing. And so they're just amazing in the basement of the British Museum, there's just collections of box after box after box of things that Wallace sent back and the things that he collected and the stuff that he did. But basically then they had to preserve them. And then they were preserving them, and he was training his helpers that he had with him. He had a young English boy with him for a while, but the famous one he had was Ali Wallace, a young Malay boy who came with him and who took to this all and loved it and so on. And I have a picture of him too. He was a young boy. He trained him how to do it, and Ali Wallace actually was the one that caught this bird of paradise. It's named after Alfred Russell Wallace.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and brought it back, and it's got these white fronds that come out from its shoulders, of just white fronds. I don't know if they're, what the purpose is of them.
Sounds sexy to me.
That's an interesting, we'll talk about a little bit of that too. Alfred Russell Wallace did not agree with Charles Darwin about sexual selection. He had different area in that. So this is a picture of Wallace here in Singapore in 1862 as he's just finishing up and he's getting ready to come back to England. So he's done his exploring, he's got his concepts, he's got all his samples and collections, and now he's going to spend the rest of his life talking about it and thinking about it and writing about it and lecturing about it and conceiving what it all means. So this was 1862. By this time he had already had his discussions and the natural selection idea had been presented, and we'll talk about that in just a second as well. So now he's ready to come back. 4 years after he sent his essay to Darwin, asking him if he thought it was good to send it on to Lyell, who was the geologist that was pretty impressive in his thoughts. So Wallace allowed his people back in England, being Darwin and Lyell and Hooker, all different scientists, to handle the knowledge that he had come up with. And they chose to handle it the way they chose to handle it, which maybe didn't help Wallace's fame and fortune as much as it could have. This is a picture of Ali Wallace, who, this was supposedly, the story is, the first time he had ever put on European clothes, just for this picture. And they were just departing, never to meet again, and Alfred Russell Wallace talked Ali into wearing this and getting his picture taken so he'd have something to remember him by, but he said he was pretty uncomfortable in those clothes. Looks like a little bit of fear in his eyes. There's a story about Ali Wallace that he had just spent days making all these presentations, stuffing and skinning and preparing all these beautiful samples of things, and he left the room, and somehow a frond of a fern that was in the room that all these preparations had fallen down and had laid against the table that all these stunning presentations were on, and ants were able to climb up the plant, travel over this frond onto this table. It had all these amazing collections, and they just destroyed it. They ate all these things up and made them worthless. So kind of out there in the world, you couldn't put anything in a refrigerator or a freezer or anything like that. It had to be preserved and presented properly. So going back 4 years earlier, prior to him leaving, he had his his moment. He was suffering from malaria, and he was kind of in a hallucinatory state or dreaming badly or wildly or something. And he had also read, as Charles Darwin had, Malthus's theory of population growth. And both of them were affected by this same story about how populations grow until they can't be fed anymore by the environment in which they live, and then they crash. And that, for both of these men, independently, 20 years apart or so, was the key moment that both then realized how evolution could be possible. Evolution happens because something occurs, a random act occurs, and a creature is slightly different than the other, and then it's naturally selected, which is Darwin's term, and it wasn't really Wallace's term, but he didn't disagree with it. But this natural selection comes along that then favors that creature to survive. Some of the differences is that Darwin seemed to emphasize it more at an individual level. So an individual has a certain characteristic that helps it survive, and it passes that along. And Darwin couldn't really explain why, because no one knew about genetics at the time. Wallace seemed to see it more as a species type of thing, where a species will adapt somehow to correct for, or to adapt to the change in the environment in which it's at. So they had some differences, and we'll talk a little bit more about both of them too. But anyways, because Wallace really appreciated Darwin, he had been corresponding with him back and forth. And earlier he had sent a letter to him and to Lyell that was pretty impressive. But this 1858 essay was a game changer. So I'll read a little bit about that here a second. By February of 1858, Wallace had been convinced by his biogeographical research in the Malay archipelago that evolution was real. He later wrote this in his biography. The problem then was not only how and why do species change, but how and why do they change into new and well-defined species, distinguished from each other in so many ways. Why and how they become so exactly adapted to distinct modes of life, and why do all the intermediate grades die out, as geology shows they have died out, and leave only clearly defined and well-marked species, genera, and higher groups of animals. He couldn't solve that problem for quite a while. According to his autobiography, it was while he was in bed with a fever that Wallace thought about Malthus's idea of positive checks on human population and had the idea of natural selection. His autobiography says that he was on the island of Ternate at the time. Wallace describes how he discovered natural selection as follows. It then occurred to me that these causes, or their equivalents, are continually acting in the case of animals also. And as animals usually breed much more quickly than does mankind, the destruction, the Malthusian destruction, every year from these causes must be enormous in order to keep down the numbers of each species, since evidently they do not increase regularly from year to year, as otherwise the world would long ago have been crowded with those that breed most quickly. Vaguely thinking over the enormous and constant destruction which this implied, it occurred to me to ask the question, why? Why do some die and some live? And the answer was clearly, on the whole, the best fitted lived. And considering the amount of individual variation that my experience as a collector had shown me to exist, then it followed that all the changes necessary for the adaptation of the species to the changing conditions would be brought about. In this way, every part of an animal's organization could be modified exactly as required, and in the very process of this modification, the unmodified would die out. And thus, the definite characters and the clear isolation of each new species would be explained. So he sent a letter later in 1858 to Darwin containing his paper, which was called On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. Not a barn burner title. Darwin received it on June 18, 1858. He was faced at that time with the terminal illness of one of his sons and just the enormity of someone maybe scooping him on natural selection. So he was very puzzled as to what to do. He sent the manuscript along to two scientist friends, Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker. The decision was made mainly by the two of them to present it as well as an essay from Darwin to the Linnaean Society. So they put together an essay that Darwin had written earlier and also a letter that he'd written to an American biologist, Asa Gray, and they presented them in order at the Linnaean Society along with Wallace's talk. The response was fairly muted. In fact, the president of the Linnaean Society at the end of that year said, there really wasn't much that went on this year of any great import or meaning or anything. So they just kind of let it all float by. Not a very perceptive
If
person.
you'd have had a better title, it would have worked out. You know?
Yeah. So, anyways, that started the whole thing going. Darwin went to production of his book. He was going to have a much more scholarly book, but because of the pressure of Wallace, he put out one sooner, calling it On the Origin of Species. And he also forego footnotes, and he did other things like I've talked about earlier. He didn't do a proper introduction.
Literature review.
Literature
giving
review.
people credit for.
Right.
Yeah.
So all of that wasn't there, which he was somewhat castigated for later, and took it very seriously. It bothered him quite a bit. So anyways, that's what went on with that. 4 years later, Wallace came back. There was never any animosity between either of the people toward each other. It was, Wallace was just honored to be included in all this. He clearly, immediately accepted primacy is what it's called, by Darwin, because Darwin had been writing and collecting and dithering notes and so on for 24 years prior to this. So, and he always admired Darwin too. So there was no consternation, but they had very interesting communications back and forth the rest of the years. Wallace was a great supporter of Darwin's thoughts, and he lectured and gave a lot of talks about it and did things from that too. This is a picture of him later as he's living in England. But he did have further scientific exploits. These are the interesting things that are very well known. Biogeography, like Scott was saying earlier, when he was in the Amazon, he noticed that if he wanted to find certain kinds of creatures, he knew to look on a certain side of the river. They'd grow better on that side of the river. They were there. Other things were on the other side of the river. So he realized the fact of biogeography is the fact of how geography plays an importance in the biology of an area. And he studied that and knew that. He's called the father of biogeography. And it involves and it includes and it helps actually contribute to the development of ecology, why the geography changes, what's there. You know, we're not just masters of our environment, and whatever we want goes wherever we want it to. So he's got a lot of emphasis in his talks about ecology, and I want to read a few things of that too. Evolutionary biology had led to that, the geology and geography of a region, and he was a famous, well-known taxonomist. He knew the taxonomy of, 3,000 beetles or something like that, all down to the last thing, and very impressive. So a very top-notch scientist in many ways. If we talk about biogeography, this isn't exactly what he did, but this is an interesting point. The study of the geographical distribution of plant and animal species, this has more of a paleontological reference to it too. When there was Pangea, South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia seem to have been configured something like this in the large supercontinent of Pangea. And if you look, different animals and plants lived in certain areas that then split apart. So the animal on the far left, a tetrapod there, its fossils have been found in South America and Africa, virtually the same fossils. And it's showing why that could be. Okay. Other animals lived in the south of South America and in the southern tip of Africa only. And why would that be? Well, because they were connected at that time when that was its range. So plants and different types of animals all have this kind of geographical distribution, and the study of how that relates to biology, some of which with a long, long history, and some of it just because the sun shines more on one side of a river bank than another, now all have impacts on it. So biogeography is a very diverse field, very interesting field.
And related to plate tectonics, obviously.
Obvious, in this regard at least. I mean, it goes everywhere. It emphasizes many different things. These are some other things that he got involved in. He, knowing how his father lived and the troubles his father had, he got very involved in social activism as well, too. Land reform, and he wrote essays and lectured about that. In fact, he was asked to represent and speak for many issues about land reform. He had a feeling that in England, you know, there were these gigantic estates owned by very wealthy people, and it was kind of left over almost from the, you know, from the period of feudal times and so on, right? Yeah, lords and ladies and different things like that. He felt that most of the rural land in England should be owned by the state and then divvied out in terms of usage and so on to all the poor people, all the middle class people and so on too. So he was very much into a land reform, economic reform as well too. Women's suffrage. He was a leading figure on fairness for all. He talked about the evils of militarism. So the more I read about him, the more I liked this guy. You know? He wasn't just kind of sitting there counting his beetles every day. You know, he was also getting involved in what makes the world a better place. Urban poverty and criminal justice. He thought that the prisons were terrible, and he had ideas about how to do it. And there's all these writings you can find of his. He was very prolific in his writings and his input. He talked about mental health and the terrible ways that people with mental health issues were treated, you know, in the mid-1800s. He emphasized the evils of colonialism, you know, and he'd seen it in the East Indies with the Dutch there and so on. So all these things had an impact and caused him to act. And he was very important. He talked about environmental damage too. So he got involved and he was able to hear and see both sides of things. I thought that was pretty impressive to me. Gosh, I got so much I want to talk about, and I'm running out of time.
You can do a little bit more in a subsequent talk as well.
Yeah. So he commented about the environment, and his extensive work in biogeography made him aware of the impact of human activities on the natural world. In a book called Tropical Nature and Other Essays, he warned about the dangers of deforestation and soil erosion, especially in tropical climates prone to heavy rainfall. Noting the complex interactions between vegetation and climate, he warned that the extensive clearing of rainforest for coffee cultivation in Ceylon, which we now call Sri Lanka, and India, would adversely impact the climate in those countries and lead to their impoverishment due to soil erosion. In island life, he again mentioned deforestation and invasive species. On the impact of European colonization of the island of St. Helena, he wrote, just calling it St. Helena is somewhat of an impact, right? Mm-hmm. He wrote, "Yet the general aspect of the island is now so barren and forbidding that some persons find it difficult to believe that it was once all green and fertile. The cause of this change is, however, very easily explained. The rich soil formed by decomposed volcanic rock and vegetable deposits could only be retained on the steep slopes so long as it was protected by the vegetation to which it in great part owed its origin. When this was destroyed, the heavy tropical rains soon washed away the soil and has left a vast expanse of bare rock or sterile clay. This irreparable destruction was caused in the first place by goats, which were introduced by the Portuguese in 1513 and increased so rapidly that in 1588 they existed in the thousands. These animals are the greatest of all foes to trees because they eat off the young seedlings and thus prevent the natural restoration of the forest. They were, however, aided by the reckless waste of man. The East India Company took possession of the island in 1651 In about the year 1700, it began to be seen that the forests were fast diminishing and required some protection. Two of the native trees, redwood and ebony, were good for tanning. And to save trouble, the bark was wastefully stripped from the trunks only, the remainder being left to rot. While in 1709, a large quantity of the rapidly disappearing ebony was used to burn lime for building fortifications. So to me, again, he was so prescient and able to see these damages to our environment, the damages to the world, and he made a point of really beautifully talking about it. His most famous book is called The Malay Archipelago, and it has been continuously in print since it came out in 1862, I believe. You can actually get online and type in the Malay Archipelago, and you can get a copy of it to read online. And I would say that I probably spent about a week that I was ostensibly preparing for this, but just reading his fascinating stories. This book was Joseph Conrad's favorite book, a man who wrote Lord Jim, and he kept it by his bedside, and he said it was his famous book, and actually the stories that he tells in Lord Jim are patterned from what he came up with from reading The Malay Archipelago by Alfred Russell Wallace. So it's a pretty amazing concept of this man's adventures and excitement and interest in the world and concern about ecology and mental health and everything else, that I think he's a fantastic guy, and I think you ought to read up more about him. He's quite a challenging character. There is a part, because he was willing to listen and have an open mind to many things, he got involved in spiritualism later in life. This is an actual picture that was taken by a spiritualist that shows Alfred Russell Wallace with his mother as a ghost, his dead mother sitting in front. It meant a lot to him, and he maybe was a little bit gullible or able to accept other things. That one reason was, I think he was open-minded, and he looked at the world and was able to see things. Sometimes science takes that hit of, if it doesn't fit in with mainstream science, it isn't acceptable to people or whatever. So one thing I think about that is Wegener with continental drift.
Right.
He, for years, had an answer for, everyone was saying, it's kind of odd, isn't it? These jigsaw-shaped pieces look like they ought to fit together, but obviously they don't. And he came up with a reason and a means for doing it, but he was soundly denounced and ridiculed for it. And so at times, science maybe has to be able to look at things like Wallace did.
Yeah, my opinion about that is succinctly stated, and it is, there's no sacred topic in science. Every question is valid. Every realm of investigation is worthwhile. And so the fact that he went down some of these trails into what we would today consider, or we know to be pseudoscience, he was just investigating them.
Right, and at that time, with what he had to investigate, he was using his mind and coming up with the concept. An interesting thing is that where he diverged from Darwin, and I meant to get into that, and I haven't done that, but he diverged from Darwin. He thought that there had to be 3 points, at least in time, in history, where something supernatural occurred that emphasized that had an impact on the world. And Darwin didn't agree with him on that, and they had back and forths on it. And I'd say that those are still times that we can relate to and think about today, too. The first one was he thought that when inorganic compounds were able to come together and make a living thing, he thought that there needed to be some level of we call it the spark of life or whatever.
Magic.
Yeah, or supernaturalism or whatever. So he thought that would not be able to be done without that. The second he thought was when consciousness developed, what he called consciousness in higher animals. So a horse has a sense that it's a horse, you'd think, and a dog, knows its doggishness, let's say, and can see how it fits in with others. It knows it's a unit itself, as compared to maybe a worm or a plant or different beetles or different things like that. And so he thought that there had to be a supernatural imposition of consciousness to higher animals. That was his second. And his third was the development of thought and reasoning and artistry. He didn't see how evolution and natural selection could produce a great artist. What would be there that would make Mozart be able to do this, or Chopin conduct his etudes and so on, or compose his etudes. And it went on to mathematicians, and how do you get to be the point that you can develop calculus or do these different things? So it was all those things that he and Darwin continued to disagree on that forever. But he's quite a challenging character. He remained an ardent defender of natural selection for the rest of his life. His varied interests in science-based investigations, coupled with his heightened social awareness and quite engaging speaking and writing style, garnered him many supporters. His thoughts opened up the many fields of biology to us that are around today and still ring true, mostly, through the years. So, here's to the instigator of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad, and ecology and natural selection, Alfred Russell Wallace.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, thank you.
Anybody online have any questions? You can either unmute yourselves or type into the chat if you're on the Zoom meeting. Oh, all I had to do was click and it panicked on me. Oh, there it is. It's still around. All right. My laptop seems just barely able to keep up with the...
Intellect that's happening here.
Yeah. All right.
Mine has no problem
Your laptop? Yeah.
competing with my intellect.
Oh, I don't know about that. Yeah, it looks like we don't have any, but, if you do have questions or comments, feel free to unmute or type into chat. But thank you all for joining. Those of you on YouTube, certainly.
Yeah. Thanks to everyone, and again, thanks to the AV folks, and have a great day.
See you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, Scott's going to be talking about weather.
What else is there to talk about?
All right.